Hi, this is our third installment of Writing a Commission in Quarantine with composer Mischa Zupko. My name is Dan Hickey. I'm the admin manager for Civitas Ensemble, and we also have Yuan-Qing Yu with us, the violinist and executive director. And we're very excited today to announce that Mischa's new piece for us is finished, title and everything.
Yeah, I thought we might be doing that today.
Cool. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about the title and how that came to be.
Yeah, so titles are always difficult, and I mean, after doing the real hard work of writing a piece, then, a lot of times I'm left at the end with, oh gosh, how to title it now. And that can be a very long process sometimes because trying to distill the idea, all of the things that were going through one's head, through the process of making something that involves this much energy, is distilling that down to one or two words is very very difficult. I mean, as any writer will tell you. I certainly don't fashion myself a writer, but I have some empathy for their pain. um, but I tend to like shorter titles. I like to not reveal too much. I like it to have kind of an impact, rather than a descriptive quality. And so packing those into a couple words is really difficult. And the things that were going through my mind, when I was writing this. Some of them were, spawned by the, initial conversations with Judy and Yuan-Qing and, and you and, some of those directions just about what is it like to write a piece in this environment, and what are some of the things that we hope to realize, to understand, to come to grips with through this unique experience. And so quiet and heartbeat and pulse and all of those things were kind of at the center of it, and those were, more or less signifying of life, even in the midst of this absolute stillness. And, when it seems like life does not abound because we're trapped indoors and we're not seeing much happening outside, there's a quiet life, and maybe even a more acute life happening within each one of us as we come to appreciate the things that are basic to our genesis and our continuation. So I kept thinking of things like "Into the Quiet," and they sounded like bad 19th century poems. And but I knew that there was something in this quiet space that was profound. Something about the quiet that forced us to reflect. It forced some to panic. Being left alone with your thoughts can be an incredibly enlightening or incredibly frightening prospect. And so I Googled. I was like, quietest sound on Earth, or quietest places on Earth. I just started roaming around that way. I mean, I approach this much in the same way that I approach writing a piece of music. Search first, do some research, and then when the spark gets lit, then go with that. And I came across the anechoic chamber, which is this chamber, an artificial sound chamber that's created for testing audio equipment. And apparently, I can't remember where it is, the quietest one was made by Microsoft for testing their equipment, and apparently it gets to as low as decibels below zero, like 40 below zero. Didn't even know that was possible, right? Well, zero is is our threshold for hearing. So that's the lowest sound that we are capable of hearing. But when you go below that, that's there's still sound, but we're just not capable of hearing it. And apparently, what I where the spark got lit is when I read that most people can't stand to be in there for more than 45 minutes at a time. And some people ask to be let out immediately. It's a terribly frightening experience for some. I guess after a period of 45 minutes, though, your hearing becomes more acute, much like, when somebody becomes blinded, their other senses become heightened. And they can start to hear things like blood rushing, from one place in their body to another place, and their heartbeat and their lungs expanding and contracting. I mean, things that we can't even imagine hearing. And this was, very much akin to the experience, on a much reduced level, obviously, but that, I was kind of feeling as, we were moving into this quarantine moment, just, this intense quiet, and all of a sudden, we're able to hear the movements of life within ourself. And I kind of meditated a little bit on, why is that frightening for some? Well, it's frightening because how fragile it is, I mean, any one of those fragile movements, that, could possibly be disrupted by, any number of events, could end a life just like that. And so I think it connects us with our fragility. And, to a certain extent, that's frightening. But then, as I mentioned in the program note that I wrote for the piece, that's also kind of why we, attribute so much beauty to life, because it is finite. It is, this delicate balance, just the same way we look at a snowflake and we say, oh my gosh, I mean, that's like if you look at it up close, one of the most beautiful and unique things, in nature, to be able to see how these crystals form, and each one different. But, I mean, touch it to a temperature just 1 degree, above the freezing point, it's gone. So, yeah, it packs a lot in just, a small idea. And I have a feeling most people are going to have to look up anechoic. So I also like, I like titles that are a learning experience too. It was a learning experience for me, but one that, kind of delved deeper into this idea, this philosophy behind quiet and you know, realization. And yeah.
It's great. No, I read your program notes last night, and it was very interesting to see how you describe it. And at the moment, I'm reading a book. It's along the
Mm.
same line as exactly what you wrote in the program notes. And the book is called Stillness is the Key. I don't know if you
Hmm.
know the book at all, but
I don't.
it's and your description about how, putting someone in the room, some people needed to run out right away. And it's a it's an interesting thought, and made me think about something that in this particular book that I haven't finished it. I just read 3 chapters of it, and the author really talks about different art experimentations and also creative processes of different artists, and one of which is the artist Marina Abramovich. Do you know the name?
Yes, I do.
So
I
she's
can't place right now who it is, but I mean, I know that Abramovich. I know that name. Yeah.
Yeah, so she's like a visual art, performing arts, and sort of a large installation type of person. And a lot of time that she is one of the subjects in
Hmm.
her performance. And so anyway, one of which was she did it at MoMA in New York, and she
Hmm.
sat at a table. You could find YouTube videos, and the objective is that she would sit there, look down, and close her eyes, and audience members who purchase tickets would take turns sit in front of her, and
Hmm.
they each person with the, of course, admission to this particular exhibit gets 1 minute with her,
Hmm.
looking eye to eye, and then the person leaves, and she looks down again until the next person comes.
Hmm.
So she did that for like almost 3 months in a row. I don't know how many hours a day, but she did it without, food, sleep, and the whole
Three
objective.
months
Yeah, I think 3 months, like 79 days or 80 some days daily.
without food and sleep.
well, I think she sleeps at night, but I don't know during the day. Maybe it's 8 to 10 hours of that.
Wow.
So she didn't eat,
Wow.
she didn't sleep during the day. But anyway,
Oh my goodness.
the exhibit is called "The Artist is Present." You know. So when I read
Hmm.
your program, sorry, is my thing dinging? Can you
Nope.
hear the ding? Oh, okay. Um, so when I read your program notes, it made me think of that.
Huh.
It's a way of being present, even in that below 0 decibel room.
Right.
What you have is the present moment, and you're with yourself or with your thoughts or with whatever you might scream or create some noise. So anyway, it was very interesting. It's a way of being present, whatever that is. And I think coming back to your composing process, you have to be present to be able to compose, to
Hmm.
be authentic, to put your what you're feeling down.
Right.
And yeah, so it made me think of you, and I just thought, wow, it's what a perfect moment. I'm reading this book and thinking
Yeah.
thinking of our place in this bizarre moment. And instead of resisting, saying, okay, what is a difficult time now, life
Hmm.
comes to a stop and you can't do anything. Instead of doing that, finding sort of a peaceful place for your mind and for our being, and just to be present and to reflect, but not over reflecting,
Mm.
and
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you make a good point there because, sometimes our thoughts are, the devil. We think ourselves out of, the importance of the moment. And sometimes, try to build archetypes for the way forward or, whatever, when actually we need to kind of respond to, what we're hearing inside. Yeah, I mean and I'm not surprised at all that you happen to be reading something like this because you read so much. You're just bound to interface with about every experience you have outside of your reading. But no, I mean it is pretty remarkable that this book does focus on an artist and that sense of presence and quiet. And I think in this time, again, we kind of get shoved to the side as artists, when everything's busy, when everything's moving. And, I mean, there's always going to be people who, thrive and live in culture. But, a lot of times there are so many other important issues in life. And I think at times like these, we realize that this is not just, a passing part of our lives, but an integral part of our lives. It's what makes us aware of where we are actually in history right now and what this moment is trying to tell us and how we are, going to respond to that moment. Um, I think we're dealing with that socially and politically right now, too. Just, we really need to stop, because we've just gotten, to this point where we're not thinking, we're just reacting now.
mhm.
And it's very hard to listen. It's very hard to listen to one another because we have such entrenched ideas about what is, good for a country, what is good for the world, what is good for, humanity. I mean, these are, incredibly entrenched and nuanced philosophical ideas that are kind of passed over in sound bites right now because we don't have the time to deal with them. We don't have the space in our heart to deal with them because of our entrenchment. And really I mean I tend to feel a sense of hopelessness sometimes when I look at this, as many people do. But I think the only thing that can overcome this is this ability to silently reflect and to really listen. I mean, it's one thing to shut up until somebody's done talking and another thing to listen, to take those words and try to make some kind of personal sense of them and be able to integrate that into a worldview.
Mhm.
Um, so
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, especially in this world, as you're saying. Even though things come to a stop, but there are a lot of disturbance and unsettling feeling and noise around us, right? To be
Yeah.
able to carve out a space that's peaceful and to be able to create during that kind of noisy environment is
Mm,
an extremely difficult thing.
yeah.
And it's interesting. I haven't gotten there, but in the book, I think in the beginning it talked about how many artists that's like, he's going to talk about in the book. One of the artists is going to be John Cage, and I assume he's going to use that piece, the 3 minutes, 45
Well,
seconds or whatever, you know.
4 minutes and 33.
Okay,
No, no. I've been over this so many times. I've gotten that time increment wrong so many.
yeah,
It's probably. I'm still not quite sure if it's 4:53 or four, but I think it's 4:33.
yeah, but it's the same idea. I think that's why I'm assuming because he's
Yeah.
cited Abramovich, right? So in a
Yeah.
sense, it's the similar experience that one creates to be left alone with the silence, and
Yeah.
you don't know what to do. But now, I think the premiere of the piece was probably a very different experience than now. People now know what to expect, but it doesn't diminish how people react, even as
Right.
as the installation of Abramovich. Everybody who goes to
Right.
the temple knows exactly what they're getting. They're getting 1 minute of staring in the eyes of her eyes, and they still react differently. Some try to behave,
Well,
body
how many people have actually done that? I
right.
mean, it's one thing to know what you're getting into, but another thing to engage in that experience.
Yeah, it's I think it's very interesting. So when I read your program notes, I just thought it's such a thoughtful way to think about the time and to think about your piece.
Mm.
And do you ever write a piece with the title coming to you first?
Hardly ever. I often feel like an affinity with Debussy in a lot of ways, and this is one of them. This kind of the imagery comes during the creation a lot of times, and the title is almost an afterthought. It's like a summation rather than a starting point. I think I used to be very different. When I was younger, I had these kind of programmatic ideals, and I would try to write stories in music. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I do like the narrative approach, but I don't know, maybe it's just getting older. Somehow the music, listening to the music more and trying to hear what it wants to do, where it wants to go, where it wants to take me, what it wants to teach me too, is more important than what I want to construct at the given moment, because I quite honestly I find newness comes from the music itself, not because I impose something on it. So and that was certainly in a very pronounced way the experience with this piece. It led me to somewhere very new for me. Even though I feel like it will certainly be recognized as something as my voice. I mean, something that harmonically speaking and gesturally speaking, it's going to sound like what I have done in the past. But in terms of where it goes and how it gets there, it really it took me by surprise, and that was one of the great things about this process. And I attributed some of it to the fact that we've been having these ongoing conversations. It's allowed me to, kind of keep reflecting in a deeper and more potent way about, how does sound communicate, a powerful message other than just the impact of the sound itself. It's we're always trying to do that as composers. We went back to even programmatic ideas, Vivaldi and the Four Seasons or Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique, trying to communicate these extra musical ideas rather than just visceral reactions and feelings. and that's a hard thing to do. And you have to be willing as a composer to allow for somebody to hear it and interpret it differently than you might have conceived it. But at the same time, if you make a bold statement, a lot of times there is kind of a general sense about what was trying to be communicated in that piece, in a general way. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Debussy because I when your last post and you sent some pictures, remember I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned in my reply to you that I actually listened to Boulez's conducting Sirène, and
Mm.
you know
Yeah.
it's I don't know why, I just felt like that was a moment, and that's such a beautiful, beautiful
Oh,
piece of
God.
music. It's just
Oh, I
so
love it.
right. It's
The
ghostly.
choir just kind of
Oh,
ghosting the orchestra all the way throughout. It's
it
it's
and
haunting.
the voice and everything. So I don't know what triggered that after I read
Hmm.
your email and you're
Hmm.
seeing the picture, and probably you know had nothing to do with Siren, your piece, but somehow it just I just had to listen to that sort of after reading everything you wrote,
Hmm.
and it put me in a good
Well,
place.
and the sirènes are basically luring the ships to their port. It's
Yeah.
that kind of analogous to the idea of the music is kind of taking one to a place rather you know than a composer crafting the destination from the beginning. So I don't know, maybe we're going too far here, but
No, no, but I mean, I don't. I mean, sometimes it's interesting, right? I don't know why.
yeah,
I just it just that came
interesting.
to
Yeah.
me, and I just had to listen to it. So I
Huh.
listened to it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well,
and
now I
so
have to go listen to that again too.
so beautiful. But
Yeah.
if this commission came in a time that's not during the pandemic, what would you think would have been different? I'm curious. Like,
Oh, that's so hard to answer.
no, no,
I
it's a
mean,
hypothetical question.
yeah,
That's
I know. I, I don't exist well in hypotheticals. I don't do well in them. Like in the same way that I talk about a musical idea creating a process for me, leading me. The situations also guide and lead me, and I try to respond to the moment. And to suggest that there was a different situation and how would I have dealt with it differently, we would assume that I would be in control of that situation, and to a certain extent. But yeah, quite frankly, I don't know what would
mhm.
have come out. May not have started so quietly. I don't know. But that could the reason that it did start from that kind of nothingness is can have as much to do with this time as it can have to do with, like I said, aging and kind of slowing down, reflecting myself, more on what is the music within me, and what is posturing, what is musical posturing. I think when we're younger, as performers and composers and creators of art, all the same, I think there is a certain amount of posturing we go through. There's we have our heroes, we have our ideals, and we want to represent those. And then as we get older, we kind of come to accept those things that are just intrinsic to our nature, and allow those to develop and kind of shed some of the self-consciousness of what we thought were ideals before. um, so yeah, I think this moment, this set of circumstances certainly did create this piece in a very unique way. But to say what would have happened otherwise, I don't know. It was interesting that Winston wrote back after I had sent the final copy, saying he was excited to see that there was a piano cadenza in there that made him earn his paycheck. And and I think to a certain extent, because of our long-standing relationship and the fact that I've written a lot of music for him, that probably would have happened in some way, shape, or form,
Right.
regardless. We talked about that, kind of in episode one of of these conversations, where, how does the particular ensemble or the people in the ensemble, the relationships that you have, affect what you write, and certainly that does, have an effect. That moment came about purely organically, because, I was, struggling with a certain problem that, I was having the piece, that the piano was always playing a certain role in this, whereas the clarinet and the violin and the cello really had this mobility that, was pleasing aesthetically to me, to be able to move from one thing to the other. But the piano kind of had this singular role, and for 10 minutes I felt like I don't quite understand how it's going to be contributing in a structural way, to this, other than to instigate. And it seems like it wants to be more. And I wasn't quite sure what that was yet, until, and early on in the piece too, I'd had this notion, like many other composers who write, in mixed chamber ensemble pieces, that, everybody in the ensemble, every instrument in the ensemble has their moment, or there are different groupings of moments. I mean, Carter, does this a lot in his string quartets. But you know, I hadn't imagined, yet that happening for the piano. And then all of a sudden, I just realized, as the piece was mounting towards its apex, the piano's involvement, was becoming, much more frequent. It was having to instigate more. And then there was just this point of realization that, it's going to leave everything else behind at a certain moment. There's not going to be any room anymore. It's articulating at this distance, then this distance, then this distance, and now the music in between is kind of getting, canceled out, and the piano takes off. And, you realize that it is kind of the genesis of the ideas that, transpired and developed throughout. And so that was kind of an exciting moment, to see that shift of dynamic there, and to have a climax take place where it really is all instruments contributing to the point, but then it's the piano taking it to the finish line, which usually it's a 2D moment, and that's that's those types of things are interesting to me. I remember one of my great mentors, Eugene O'Brien at Indiana University. He was a wonderful, absolutely wonderful composer. He said to me early on in my training, and I didn't understand this at the time thoroughly, but he said, it's really, one of the big challenges structurally in making a piece is deciding what the climax is. I think, and again, this is, an issue of when I think you're early on in your artistic, formation. You think of climax as high point. It's just automatic, just the same way, you phrase to the highest note, and, things like that. But, the idea of, an anticlimax, or, being a climactic moment, like a sudden pause, or, the bottom dropping out, or in this instance, the lack of, musical or instrumental reinforcement of an idea, a solo voice. How can a solo voice be a climax? Well, we've certainly seen that, I mean, Martin Luther King, Jr. was a solo voice that spoke, resonated for, millions upon millions of people. I mean, that idea that a solo voice can, take something to its height is kind of an interesting idea. And it's quite real too, I think. So I forgot where we started. Forgive me. Don't know how I got on that topic,
Well,
but yeah.
continue on the something you mentioned. You talked
Mm,
about your mentors and the. I'm just trying to remember everything you just touched upon, and triggered something. It could be a dumb question on my part as well, but I feel like as you are talking about, it's such an organic process that you're composing. It's almost that the creative process is taking you along for the ride. But at
mm,
some point, you have to assert
yeah,
some form
of
of
course.
control over it.
Yeah, yeah.
Could you talk about, the balance of that? And it leads forward into my second question is when you talk about your uh, mentor,
Mm,
and makes me think about how a teacher, a mentor, teaching composition students,
mm,
how do you cultivate the individual voice as you talk
yeah,
about the voice, while teaching the person to become this
yeah.
polished composer?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, those are two very interrelated questions. And, again, is, something that you learn through experience and time. Um, so, I think the control issue is different for everybody. We've gone through periods of, absolute absence of, control. I mean, if you think of Cage, and, rolling the dice to make decisions. Well, he would argue that they're not making decisions, but that they're those decisions are already kind of in some ways predetermined, or maybe even the lack of decision. The composer is just the medium through which the music flows, not the architect. Um, to multiple serialism in the 50s and 60s, where not only were the pitches systematically numbered, but so were the articulations and dynamics and every aspect of the form that can one could assign a place, an order to. And the funny thing was when comparisons were made between those two extremes of well, I'm not sure that these two things really have that much of a different effect in some ways. And I think that's kind of funny in a way. There's, I think the control comes in kind of control over oneself, like to paring down and limiting what one wants to say. I think that's the most difficult thing, because we have so much to say. And oftentimes we want to say it in a small space of time. So I remember in some of my earlier pieces, like literally trying to cover the gamut of expression of technical finesse, and in the span of 10 to 20 minutes. And so the way that takes place for me now is I play, I experiment, I start a piece, I just start by writing, and I let it, if it's something that's exciting, I let it go for maybe a minute, 2 minutes, and see where it is. And then I take stock, and I start to doodle on separate pages. What are some possibilities? What am I hearing? And sometimes when I'm sitting there at those doodle pages, nothing comes. And then I'll go take a shower, or go pick up my son from school or something, and something hits me. Okay, I take out my iPhone, make a dictation, go home and quickly write it down, and then start playing again. So I think you have to let go of a certain amount of control in terms of when it's going to happen, when it's going to come. And that was, I think, what was hard for me because, I came from a performance tradition. I came from you sit in your practice room until you clean that passage. And so the idea that, you're sitting in your studio and, with a pencil in hand and literally not writing anything or, nothing's coming to mind was a pretty, terrifying prospect. And it made me feel as if I had no control. And I had to learn that the control mechanism is a little bit different, with composing than it is for performing. I think there are some, there's some intersections for sure. But I had to learn to let go of if in the moment, I'm not able to assert my control, then I have to do what's best for the piece now. And sometimes that's planning. Sometimes that's just playing. Sometimes I'll just, as a pianist, I'll just play through it, because it's, there's a certain, kind of sensibility that you get about the piece from, actually having a physical relationship to it. Sometimes I'll let it go and I'll, go outside and, take a walk. Sometimes I'll say, you know what, I'm not going to compose tomorrow. That's actually an act of creation. Saying I'm not going to do this tomorrow because, sometimes doing, by, forcing yourself to do it, that's just an act of compulsion and not creation. But ultimately, what, by allowing, that, the strands of this, of the DNA of this piece to start weaving together, you're allowing it to grow. You're allowing it to prosper, instead of like saying, you got to grow now, and you can't stand over a plant and keep watering it, and so that it will reach your desired outcome. You have to water it, and then you have to walk away and come back to it and see the progress later. So I've learned to kind of to alternate my tasks with the composing, and when it's time to organize it, I know now. It's like I have this sense about what's going to happen. There was this certain point at which I was like, piano is going to do a solo. Okay, now I know what's going to happen at the end. Okay, and now here's how I'm going to structure it. Just kind of plot it out in a very general way so as not to get in my own, in my own way, not as, so not to be a stumbling block for myself, but just give myself some parameters within which I'm working. So, but in those moments of realization, I think I mentioned in my my blog about this last installment that it's like a puzzle coming together. Where we've all had that experience, probably doing a crossword or a jigsaw or something, where all of a sudden a single letter in a crossword or a single number in a Sudoku or triggers the rest of the thing, and you can see it. It's like this epiphany, and I've learned to trust that that's going to happen. I don't think I always trusted that in the past, but that's something that I've come to trust more. And when it does happen, you seize the moment, and you become an architect, and assert some of that that control, because that's the moment in which you're actually hearing what the piece wants to be.
It's great. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about a lot of things, right? I think control is control and the sense of freedom, I think, goes hand in hand. And as you're talking, sometimes you let go of things, stopping to compose for a day and allowing yourself that space. Right. That's freedom. And then you'll become more creative the next day. So, I mean, the time now is also weird, right? Because we're also, there are obviously outside forces that's totally out of our control. And I'm struggling also between daily facing, okay, I want to control the day. I want to, how am I put out my agenda? I want to practice. I want to get this done. I want to get that done. And then there are days that I say, okay, today is not going to be a good day for me to practice, and I let go. And it's actually, it's liberating.
It is.
Yeah, and you also mentioned about the control, the word control in composing, like creative process versus performing. which I also feel that's a hard thing. Like as a teacher, I
Yeah,
talk to
yeah,
my students about this because you have to let go certain amount of control to be in the moment of playing the music and to be effective to
yeah.
the listeners. But then you can't let go so much control that you go overboard.
Right,
You know,
right.
and I've had performances where I really push myself to be in the moment because I want to feel the music, and it feels good to feel the music, right? And it feels good to be taken by the music because those are the moments that we live for.
Yeah.
But then I have had performances where I got so close to going overboard. I'm thinking, my heart rate is going. It's not even difficult. And I can remember it's a slow piece. It's a slow movement. It's beautiful, but I wanted to be taken by the music. And I thought, shoot, people are sitting so close to me and they can see my heart pumping and my bow is gonna shake. And so I totally know the limit of the line, and sometimes the line
Yeah.
is not that clear because we all want to get as
Right.
close as possible to that line without
Right.
going,
Well,
lunging over.
and I think it's great that you relived that trauma for all of your students, because I think one of the things that they benefit from more than anything is recognizing that that is not something you're supposed to overcome necessarily. It's something you're supposed to embrace and learn how to deal with and learn how to cope with. And yeah, that line is always moving. That line between where is going too far in the moment, and where is where are you not asserting your control, and then sometimes when are you trying to control too much, and then it
Right.
becomes a sterile performance, and it's like, we don't live for those moments, certainly, even though they may feel like a hole in one in some ways. It also, it's just kind of empty at the end. But yeah, you brought up the student piece of this as well, and I realized I didn't address that question really. And um, but I think it kind of boils down to helping students, understand, where is that fine line between, an absolute loss of control and completely going on instinct and moment, and then being able to back up and understand their music from the perspective of somebody who's hearing it for the first time. And what I really, when you posed the question, you said, how do you help a student navigate in their own voice, but at the same time assert control? And that is a difficult thing. I mean, Bartok, I think at one point said, composition is impossible to teach, and that's certainly not true in its entirety. There's certain aspects of it you can't teach, but I think I think being able to allow a student to explore what they are hearing first is really critical. You can't make judgments about what they put on the page at first, unless it's just completely misconceived. Unless they think they're getting one thing, and that's so. I usually start with questions. I start with, what is it that you're imagining here? What effect do you want this to have? Or I just ask them what was the inspiration behind the idea. I try to get a sense of what it is they want others to hear from that music. So that and that didn't always used to be my path, but I mean, I think more recently it has, because I recognize you can't get somebody to write a good piece about something that's not theirs. You can't impose an ideal about music on somebody and expect them to be able to work it out like a trained monkey. They're going to create what they're going to create, but you have to help guide them to create to create the best thing out of the materials that they've put forth. And so that that involves a lot of questions, and helping them to answer those questions by either guiding them to similar situations in music that is in existence, or helping them to kind of, problem solve, for a situation that may be unique to their situation. And then sometimes, teaching, I sometimes say that, teaching composition lesson is 50%, kind of musical, technique, and 50% therapy. Sometimes you have to teach how to let go, how to, assert control, all these things that we were talking about. And a student that I, have been recently teaching, he's a young fellow who's at the Interlochen Academy, and he was back early for the summer because of the pandemic, and asked to have some lessons throughout the summer, and we were working together on a piece, and he got to a certain point with it, and I could just tell he was getting tired. Situations being what they are, being indoors all the time, and the piece itself was starting to stagnate a little bit in his head, and from one week to the next, he wasn't getting any work done on it. And so I asked him, I said, well, what are you listening to these days? And he said, well, I've been listening to some film scores and things. Oh, what, and we kind of went with that for a little bit, and at the end of the conversation, I said, well, why don't we write a film score? How are we going to do that? So we looked at a couple of excerpts of various films online, and we picked something from The Gladiator, and I ripped it off of YouTube and stripped the sound. I probably shouldn't say this because now YouTube's going to come after me. But I stripped the sound from it. We decided on a 2-minute fragment that he was going to score, and he did it. And he the excitement about writing was renewed because it was a completely, kind of new experience for him, but something that, he had always had a close relationship to film music, and it was, an opportunity. And I mean, he is a very, very adept, concert stage composer. I mean, shoot. Oh, sorry. my screen shifted, and I thought I cut out there. I don't know why this is doing. What is going on here? All right, sorry. The internet can be so rude sometimes. But yeah, he had this relationship with film music that I think he was kind of bearing, not really thinking about, just because there weren't opportunities at the moment. He's a high school kid, and sometimes there's there can be some some taboo about classical composers writing film music, which I think is absolute horse crap. But we went into that, and when we got out of it, he got something together that he was proud of, that a new experience he was excited about, and ready to go back to that other piece and rethink it. And sometimes it's there are going to be moments like that. I mean, I've been fortunate in the last few years that I haven't had major sticking points, which was kind of my norm, through a certain period of my writing. And but when I do hit those points now, I understand what you have to do is not stop being creative. You have to be creative in an alternate way. You have to redirect those energies and reignite the fire for creating, because without that it's really, really difficult, and it's excruciating. It's an excruciating task because it takes an intense amount of mental energy, and when there's nothing supporting that, it's hard to keep doing what you're doing. So as regards students, yeah, I mean, that's the therapy part of it. When you're recognizing that a student, at a certain point, is struggling, not because they don't know how to write or they don't have the technique to do it, but because they've just, for whatever reason, fallen out of love with the process of whatever they're working on. You have to kind of help them to understand what made them fall in love with it in the first place. And sometimes that is seeing other people. So,
Yeah. That's such a good point, though, I think, what you made. And when you say therapy, that's so true because
yeah.
musicians, we create as who we are. If we're not well inside, we're not creating anything. That's,
Well, and I think of as a violinist. I mean, you must be thinking of Dorothy DeLay to a certain extent, who was, a therapist of sorts as well for for her students.
all
And
teachers are, right?
yeah,
Especially, I don't know about, teachers for English, or that's probably true too. If you're teaching somebody to how to write, you also have to have your authentic voice and, you know, be connected with yourself in many ways. If you're detached,
yeah,
writing is not going to be effective. And as performers, as composers, it's the same thing. If we can, like, going back to the control issue, if we control too much and it's all technique, then the
yeah,
music is definitely not effective. But if we,
right,
you know, such a difficult profession. I mean,
yeah,
and teaching, it adds another level of complexity, because you're dealing with another human being. Let alone, it's
right,
difficult with myself, but I have to,
right.
yeah,
You're taking your control issues and then having to diagnose,
right. So I mean,
someone else's.
it's easy if my student played for me something and it's out of tune. Okay, we can address that. But in terms of the musical interpretation, sometimes I listen and I think I'm using a mirror, holding the mirror up and looking at myself, thinking how much of it is that I'm imposing my interpretation
Yeah,
onto the students, and how much of it is that actually the interpretation is wrong, right?
right.
So there's always that adjustment too for me, and I think we do the same thing with our own playing too, because we want to recreate, we want to create something new, even if it's the 100th time that I play Tchaikovsky,
Yeah,
and how much of it is too far. And so, as composing, I can only imagine that you want to have new voice and new discovery of yourself, at the same time staying true to, say, who I am as a composer.
well, and I think at the nexus of all of this, I mean, the kind of, the point at which we understand what the path forward is listening. It's intense listening. When you are at a certain juncture and you're with a student, and you don't want to impose your interpretation on them, but you want to allow theirs to rise, and to and for them to have more discernment about how they're going to approach that. You have to teach them how to listen. When I deal with my own music, it's always about listening to what's actually coming out, what's actually happening, rather than my idea about what's happening. So it kind of brings us back to the kind of the beginning of this discussion in a way. you know the key to the way forward is always an intense amount of listening. When I teach piano too, and so I have the performance side of it too. And whenever I'm trying to get a student to express something, I go into well, how is the music constructed? How did what's the sentence structure here? How did Beethoven lay this out? Differently than Mozart, for instance. I'll take a look at what's unique about the phrasing of the music, or maybe harmonically where it's going, or the structure, to help a student start to have ideas of their own, about oh, it's kind of cool that there's a slow introduction to this piece, whereas in most sonatas there's not. And wow, that allegro section didn't really start anew. It kind of was a transition into the allegro. And how did that take place? Obviously, I'm thinking about a very specific example here, but just noticing things like that, or helping a student to seek out what is unique about the way a composer approaches each piece allows them to start having ideas. And that's where they get dangerous. Yeah.
It's so wait, so when did you actually start writing the piece? Which do you remember
Oh,
exactly?
I think it was sometime in May, but I didn't really get cooking until like the beginning of June.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So, it's always funny. These processes seem like instantaneous and ever so long at the same time. It's like it seems like forever ago that I started that piece, but really, it's not that terribly long ago. Um, and the passage of time, is kind of interesting because there would be, kind of fallow weeks where nothing would happen on it. It would just kind of stagnate. And then other weeks where it was like, oh, look, half the piece just came out. Um, so, but about 2 months ago, I think was, when it started. And this was, I think I mentioned, and it got finished on August 15th, which Stephen, you're one of the folks on your board, he'd asked me to put a deadline in there for myself, and I'm like, August 15th. And I'm like, yeah, all right. Finally did something right.
That's why you said it's right on the deadline.
Yeah. Because
I
he
was
wanted
thinking,
some.
I don't remember giving you a deadline.
Well, he wanted something in the contract. That's why musical groups have boards, because otherwise we just run amok. We just be like, oh, creating beauty. Like, yeah, but so. But yeah, no, I mean, usually within contracts, you do establish a deadline, and uh, I thought, that's reasonable. That could happen. And so it did.
That's pretty quick. I mean, so how often do you actually listen to the first reading and then you say, well, that, is not a good passage for that violinist.
Mm.
Let's say I can't play those high notes. What do you do?
I said, well, come on, try harder. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Practice, go home.
No, and there's another fine line, that, yeah, I mean, I even found as a performer myself, there were things that, I would try. I remember in particular, there's this piece by Kurtog. It was a song cycle for, a mixed instrumentation of 13 instruments and mezzo soprano, and I can't remember the title of the piece at the moment. But I remember there were a couple moments in there that was like, you literally physically cannot move from this end of the piano to that end of the piano in the amount of time that is being stated. And then I found a way. So, redistribution sometimes just the reflexes catch up to the practicing. And there's sometimes where you say as a performer too early that something is not possible until you've grappled with it. I mean, that was certainly the case in history. I mean, the first time I can't remember which quartet it was, but that read the Grosse Fugue said okay, this is not playable, but now it's a standard part of the repertoire, and most any quartet worth its metal can perform that piece and perform it pretty strikingly well. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting over certain things, but then there are, of course, those things where it's like, well, we don't have a G string up there, we can't do that.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I usually try really hard to do whatever is.
yeah,
I remember doing some Music Now concerts that were so like, how can I remember the pattern of that, passage
yeah.
movement? And I practice and I practice, and eventually you get there. But my, even if I get those notes, it might not be the notes that you like. So there's that, right?
Well, then they're your notes.
Okay.
No, I mean, certainly those are things that come into my mind too as I'm writing. I mean, I don't ever set out to make life difficult. I mean, I have that perspective as a performer of unnecessary, complexity. And some people, who are into, complexity would say, well, what's unnecessary about it? I'm not trying to challenge that notion. But what I'm saying for myself, I found that there's certain elements, that do provide unnecessary complexity. You can get the same thing across in a way that's going to make it feel freer for the performer, not to make them work less necessarily, to just work differently, be able to work on different things rather than just remembering that pattern. For instance, sometimes a pattern isn't as important as the gesture itself, and you want to take that into consideration when you're writing that pattern, or lack thereof. So, I always am weighing those considerations, but certainly, I've been called to task when something is, not exactly playable, and we work on it. We try to, adjust so that it is the same effect, that it's, that all the idea still gets across, that we don't eliminate, critical notes from the DNA, but that we can make it work so that it feels good to play as well as sounds good. And it's going to sound better anyway if it feels good to, for the performer to play it. And that's not an argument for writing idiomatic music either. Because that can be a limiting idea, to write just idiomatically for an instrument. Well, let's do what, the violinists like to do or the clarinetists like to do. It's kind of fun when a, violinist or clarinetist gets to do something that hasn't been done, and they get to figure out how to do it and get to present that to the world. So,
I always, I used to say when I play some new work that I judge how good it is by how difficult it is. And it's not difficult in a sense that it has to be fast or confusing, but it requires good technique. It could be a very long note, but delicate control and precise control. So, so I like to have a challenge in performing, because if anybody, if I'm not putting down little kids, but if a 7-year-old can play something that put it in front of me, then I don't think it's, you can't tell the difference, right? So I say that only because I've played also in Music Now concerts where it says, throw your bow on the string and let it bounce however many times, anybody can do that, or play random pitch. I'm not discrediting that way of writing, but on my mind, if the whole piece is only that, then you could use somebody else. Like,
yeah. Driving a Mercedes like a like a Ford Explorer, or I don't know, that's a bad example.
I know what
you
mean.
Get you get the idea.
Yeah,
Ford
so
Escort, that's what I was looking
I
for.
appreciate a challenge.
Yeah.
And you get me for it. So.
Right.
The piece I was working on once, it was a percussion concerto, but with a wickedly difficult bass clarinet solo part. And I spent weeks and weeks and weeks. I was in my undergrad learning this part, and then the composer came to a rehearsal, and I think I was getting down on myself for missing a note or two or something, probably more than that. And he looks at me and says, "It's all jazz. Don't worry about it."
Oh,
A
I
little taken
hate
aback
that. I'm
by
so
that.
sorry.
I know.
Yeah, I know. There's nothing worse than being earnest and finding out you didn't need to be. And also it's like, I'm very well aware of that feeling of like, why would somebody not want me to really mind that passage for all it's worth? I mean, why would they write that and just want me to fake it? It's that just feels dishonorable.
I have to find
that page.
Are you what?
For a lot of notes on that page, I figured you'd want me to get as many as possible.
right.
But
I've played a piece also. I have to find. It was many years ago, maybe 6-7 years ago, in a Music Now concert. Can't even remember who the composer. But it was pages and pages. The whole piece was running notes in different combinations and random. And it's every single player. It's not just the violins, and like 10 players. So I snapped a few pictures. I was like, it's not possible. I mean, and it's not meant to be possible. And it's just across the board for the whole ensemble. what can you hear? So I'm going to send you the pictures, and you tell me.
Oh, wonderful! I'll tell you if it's possible. Are you going to make me practice it?
No, but you can tell me, are these notes really worth learning? Because I did spend some time, and then at some point I was like, no. Especially when I look at the score, I was like, what can you hear out of that?
Right. It's interesting though. Yeah, I remember a piece that was just sounded like absolute brutal murder to learn and perform. But it was this kind of everything was moving constantly, and you wondered about alignment too. How could people possibly align in this environment? But it was somehow a startlingly effective piece, and sometimes that can happen. Sometimes, and I do to a certain extent empathize with composers who say, they're writing to the edge of, the limits of perceptibility, and there is something that comes out of that. Okay, but I also, again, as a performer, it's like there's a limit when you have to survive as a performer. There's so much time you have to allocate to so many different things, and if it's a very special circumstance, and this group of musicians is going to be paid well to allocate a good amount of time to really exploring this, high theory, then I think there's some fairness in it, but when it's just like thrust upon you, and like you're saying, you're having to spend weeks and weeks and weeks working out something that the composer was like, well, it's inconsequential. That's where I have a problem with it. If it's absolutely consequential, and the composer knows that if you nail this, and you're willing to go those lengths, then it's fair. But I think the disparity happens when there isn't kind of an understanding at the outset of what is the goal that's trying to be achieved, and knowing that everybody is kind of responsible for the outcome. The composer, and it has to be held to that that test too. They have to know what will come out when you do all that practicing to a certain extent. Yeah. So, my 2 cents about experimentalism.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe that piece that I complained about was extremely effective, but my part wasn't. So,
right, and there's gonna be some discord, I think, oftentimes between composers and performers in that regard, because you're dealing with it from the front line. Whereas the composer's dealing with it from the gallery.
Yeah, so there's a macro and micro component, and I don't know, for a composer, if you want to achieve this effectiveness in the macro sense, you have to write it in my part cannot be more micro, so really down to every accidental. It looks like he meant to put it there. But in the end, it was just, I'm in the mix of, a pot of stew,
Well, and sometimes composers think in terms of, algorithms. I think this is kind of a natural outgrowth of, the computerization of so many things, and it's just maybe even an offshoot of multiple serialism in a way, kind of a way of asserting control without actually having to have it. Sometimes those algorithms, or those ideas about pattern, can transform what you would have written otherwise, and that. But like you say, at the micro level, that can be awful difficult to deal with, because it's going against your grain. It's going against your ability to conceive of this massive information in a frame of time that it has to be conceived of in. And maybe for the composer too, like I said, sometimes they let a process go, so they start a process, let it go, and then want to see what happens. So again, I try not to impose judgment on those things. Personally, myself, I don't like to do that. I don't like to just throw a process and say, what happens happens. I painstakingly go over the piece numerous times throughout the process, to determine, is this necessary? Is there a better way? Before, sticking to my guns and saying, okay, this is what it is. And I feel like I need to hear it. Even with this piece, like, there's a lot of aleatoric elements where, things are, unpredictable in terms of exactly how they'll align until, I produce a musical cue later. And that's, again, nothing terribly new. But I certainly don't say, well, this sounds good, and that sounds good, and, and harmonically sounds good. All right, should be fine. No, I mentally go through different scenarios of listening to how the relationship of those things will be given different approaches. So I like to hear outcomes when I'm composing, and I don't just like to say, well, this is an interesting idea, I wonder if it will work. Yeah, but then again, there's limitations with that too. I may not realize something that might have been realized by people other than me, which would be the brave performers on the front line saying, why the hell did he write this? But, they produce something beautiful in the struggle. So.
No, I can't wait. I want to read it with people.
People, we just want people.
I just want people in the same room and play simultaneously without having to use, Adobe Premiere. I'm sick of it.
Yeah, I know.